Yes. So our first guest is Richard Samuels from Ohio State University with a talk entitled "Innate Necessarily So" on the indispensable role of the innateness concept in cognitive science and perhaps also AI. He is a professor of philosophy and member of the Center of Cognitive and Brain Sciences at Ohio State University. He did his master in artificial intelligence at Sussex University and PhD in philosophy at Rutgers. He's interested in topics such as cognitive development, reasoning, computational models of cognition, and the modular theories of cognition. So we can start. Thank you once again for being with us today.
Let me start by apologizing for the bad punning title. I'm sorry about that. So there are two very different sorts of anti-nativist challenge. So there's a kind of conceptual challenge that Matthias was talking about just now, where the claim is that the very concept of innateness is problematic in some way that prohibits its legitimate use in the sciences. And there's another kind of challenge, which we're also very familiar from, I guess, especially from studies of language and more broadly from developmental psychology and developmental neuroscience, where the claim is we have good empirical reasons to suppose that there are few, if any, innate cognitive traits. So a kind of classical empiricism a la Hume or Locke might be an example of this. More recent kinds of empiricism associated with connectionism and deep learning might be examples. Certain kinds of constructivism and, of course, radical behaviorists like Skinner. I want to point out that these are really quite different sorts of challenge. So in contrast to the conceptual challenge, the empirical challenge, as it's ordinarily prosecuted, presupposes that the very notion of innateness, or at least something very much like it, is serviceable. And the reason for this is that, first, they take the assessment of nativist hypotheses, such as, for example, Chomsky's hypothesis that there's a universal grammar that's innate, as a substantive empirical matter. And the second thing is that such views very typically countenance traits, cognitive structures that are innate, or at any rate, appear on the face of it to be innate. So what I want to do today is primarily focus on this conceptual issue. And as I think we got this impression from Matthias's introductory comments, this is a very, very broad topic for this conference. And I've only got 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do is briefly consider 3 complaints about the innateness concept. And I actually thought I'd focus on the ones that was included on the blurb for the conference. It's a hazy, not well-defined term, and it's useless. And I then want to make a few comments about the role of the innateness concept in cognitive science. And I'm not going to be defending the indispensability of the concept. Frankly, there are a lot of puzzles about that, but I do want to suggest that it's playing a role that seems to be indispensable given anything like the sort of cognitive science we currently have. And then I want to take up the issue of AI and innateness. And I think that most of the interesting issues are sort of empirical issues here. We don't know. It's going to depend on how the AI research develops over time. And I think by everybody's account, we're in early days even now. But I do want to point out that there's a certain parallel role in artificial intelligence for the role that the notion of innateness is playing in cognitive science, in developmental psychology in particular. And I then want to very briefly conclude with some comments about the relationship between innateness claims regarding organisms, human beings, and other species of organism, and also research or claims in AI. Okay, so briefly, 3 different complaints about innateness, about the innateness concept. There are way more than 3, and I'm not even going to discuss all the ones that Matthias mentioned. So here's a first one, and this is a very common thing. It's sometimes associated with this observation. You've got this massive shopping list of different definitions, none of which seem to very well capture what we mean by innate. So the complaint is that innateness is not a well-defined concept. Normally when philosophers certainly, but I think many scientists as well, talk about a concept being well-defined, they mean that there's no set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for the application of a concept or a word that expresses that concept. And normally the worry is not simply that there's no set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. They're easy to come up with, but the problem is that they're not widely agreed upon, in the sense that whatever definitions we do have don't seem to very well fit our actual usage of the term or the concept. And this is an old worry, and you find it, for example, in Hume. So Hume's discussing Locke, and Hume complains both about Locke and the people he refers to as the schoolmen, which I guess are the medieval philosophers who, making use of undefined terms, the term innate in particular, draw out their disputes to a tedious length without ever touching the point in question. And Hume's response to this worry is really not to try very hard to come up with a satisfying definition of innateness that comports well with its current usage. Rather, he engages in what we might think of, what philosophers today might call a piece of conceptual engineering. Roughly speaking, what he does is he says, here's how I think the term or the concept ought to be used. So he provides us a more precise specification of what he thinks innate should mean. And he says it's probable that it means no more than those, and he's particularly concerned with innate ideas or innate concepts, who denied innate ideas, that all ideas were copies of our impressions, our sensory perceptions, if you like. Though it must be confessed that the term which they employed were not chosen with such caution, nor so exactly defined as to prevent all mistakes about their doctrine. So he just means they're copies. When he's talking about innate ideas, he just means denying innate ideas is just to say that they're not that they are copies of impressions. And the nativist is going to be someone who says they're not copies of our impressions or constructed from copies of our impressions. But he then goes on, notes quite immediately that his usage seems to have a really rather odd consequence. It certainly doesn't fit with the usage of his day, because as he characterizes it, it's going to turn out that basically, by definition, impressions, that is sensory perceptions, are going to be innate, and concepts are, under this characterization, assuming empiricism, are not going to be innate. So, I mean, the initial obvious puzzle is, and just to point out that there's, he's got his relatively clear definition. It doesn't fit at all well with usage. Whoever thought? I take it would be surprising to discover that all of our sensory impressions are innate. That seems surprising. I don't want to delve into different definitions of innateness now. I think that this is going to be an issue that comes up later. But I do want to raise a sort of a general methodological point, which is, so what if we don't have an agreed definition of innateness? And I really mean that. And I mean that for a range of reasons. First of all, there appear to be many serviceable concepts that lack definitions. If the history of philosophy is anything to go by, the appearance would be that basically most concepts appear to lack specifications in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Why we would make that a requirement on use of the notion of innateness is really quite obscure. Another thing that's worth noting is that even in domains where we do have what seem to be very serviceable and useful definitions of a concept or a notion, there's often a lack of agreement regarding what the correct concept is. So just to use an example, think about the concept of a natural number. There you have something which has been defined many, many times over. If you look at the philosophy of mathematics, you've got broadly Dedekindian or constructuralist characterizations, you've got Phrygian characterizations as cardinalities, you've got ordinal conceptions a la Øystein Lindboe and various other philosophers and mathematicians. That doesn't mean that the notion of a natural number is somehow useless. The point is this, that not having a widely agreed upon definition doesn't necessarily mean that a concept turns out to be without use. It could be without use for other reasons, but that alone doesn't seem to be a block on it. Just a quick aside, It's worth noting there are a lot of ways of being clear when formulating innateness hypothesis that really don't seem to have much to do with the notion of innateness as such. So there are particularly two things. You probably want to get your grain of description as precise as possible. And you also, where it's not apparent in context, you want to specify what the reference class is. So what I mean by the grain issue is don't simply say language is innate, right? The problem there, or at least not the only problem there, is that there's a puzzle about what innateness is. The problem is what we're actually saying is innate. There are, as linguists and psycholinguists and psychologists and neuroscientists know, many different aspects of language. And if you're going to go and have a well-formed hypothesis, you want to specify as precisely as possible what the relevant structures are you're claiming are innate. Also, where it's not apparent from context, you want to specify what the reference class for the claim is. Innateness claims, quite generally, are claims made relative to a type of organism or a type of system. And merely saying that, for example, the object concept is innate probably requires you to say more about the reference class. In most contexts, that's pretty obvious, but sometimes it can be less than obvious when you're talking about, for example, a particular subpopulation. Okay, here's a second kind of criticism, which I think is really widespread. I think it's especially widespread in the reaction amongst biologists to ethology, so classical ethology, but I think it's widespread in developmental systems theory and various other areas as besides. And the idea is that the notion of innateness embeds a false dichotomy between nature and nurture. So Patrick Bateson is a very influential biologist whose one central idea, in addition to people like Susan Oyama and various other people, Yves Jablonka, have sort of pushed this line quite strongly. And he asks, sort of almost in a tone of perplexity, why has the discredited nature-nurture opposition persisted in popular accounts of where behavior comes from, and even in some scientific literature? And he has in mind various dichotomies there, but the idea of innate is often, he's thinking, used as a label for what's natural. And he thinks that's a mistake. He thinks that's a mistake because learning and development isn't really a result of one or the other. This either-or thinking is problematic. Well, just some brief comments. I mean, I agree that nature versus nurture is a false dichotomy. I think that sometimes innate really is used to express the nature side of the dichotomy. I think, for example, Bateson is doing it in the article from which I quoted. The thing is, I don't think by and large cognitive scientists and neuroscientists are guilty of this, of at least such a coarse-grained kind of confusion. So it seems to me that there is what we might loosely call an interactionist consensus in much of behavioral and brain science. And sort of what I mean by this is that the idea that there are really no interesting cognitive traits that are solely the product of genetic factors or solely the product of environmental factors. Rather, such factors invariably interact. And further, it really seldom makes sense to try and partition the causal influence of nature over nurture, because there are lots of interaction effects. We can't assign in particular, and this is the way Margolis and Lawrence put it, we can't assign a certain percentage to the influence of environmental factors and a certain influence to genetic factors. So all of the stuff, I take it, is really the use of innateness, or whatever role, legitimate role it's playing, is really tends to be occurring against this background of interactionist consensus. And the final kind of criticism that, again, was noted in the blurb for the conference is innateness isn't a useful concept. And obviously, there's a question about useful for whom and useful for what. And maybe, and I'm sure this is the case, that for many people's projects, it won't be useful, and that's fine. But the obvious way of providing a response to this sort of concern is to provide some indications of usefulness. So I'm going to go in two steps. So the first thing is just to make the observation that Fiona Cowie, who alas died a few years ago, herself really no friend of innateness, but made the following observation about, as it were, a pragmatic value to research, which has had the innateness concept as a central role. So she's talking about the developmental sciences over the last 20 or 30 years. And she says that developmental sciences that are currently making use of the idea of innateness have been hugely productive. The search for the innate has inspired philosophers, psychologists, biologists, and you could add extra to that list, linguists and so on, to investigate the development of so-called innate traits in extraordinary depth, leading to a vast explosion of knowledge about how the processes of development unfold in us and other species. That seems like a reasonable assessment. There's obviously grounds for concern at the edges of that, but the rough idea seems about right. It's led to some really interesting science. There's something else I also want to do, and this takes me to my next section. I want to consider a specific function that the innateness concept seems to play. And I think it's become, the idea that it plays this role has become fairly commonplace as a view amongst a lot of philosophers of cognitive science and philosophers of psychology. Okay. So what I want to do now is, I guess, following on and developing the idea of a certain usefulness for a concept, I want to point to a function of the innateness concept. So here's a bit of background. There's absolutely no reason why you should be aware of this, but there was a while ago, me and a bunch of other people, Fiona Cower, one of them, Eric Margolis and Steve Lawrence, Gabe Siegel, and a number of other people defended in various ways an account of the concept of innateness as it functions in cognitive science. And it was sometimes called primitivism, and this is a rough statement. So the idea is that you take some cognitive trait, maybe it's the possession of a concept of an object, and the idea is that that concept, that trait is innate, just in case it satisfies for a type of organism, just in case it satisfies a pair of conditions. The trait is not acquired by organisms of that type via a psychological process of some sort. And second of all, and this is just really factoring in background conditions, the sorts of things that psychologists and cognitive scientists are typically interested in. They're concerned with those kinds of acquisition tasks in the context of normal development, as it were, something like a reasonably standard human environment, though that's an extremely hard notion to define. One thing to note is that this assumes a kind of familiar inventory of psychological processes for acquisition. So we think we get information about the word via various sorts of perceptual processes, olfaction, vision, audition, and the like. We think there are various kinds of broadly inferential processes, deductive reasoning, induction, adduction, for example. We think there is a whole slew of learning processes, which induction and abduction can be examples as well. We think there's also various sorts of statistical learning, reinforcement learning, conditioning, and so on. It's not a closed list, but it's a pretty familiar list to people who work in the cognitive and behavioral sciences. And so when you apply it to examples, what it would mean, and it fits quite well with claims like this, when Chomsky says universal, the language faculty or the language acquisition device is innate, one way of interpreting that is he's saying that it's not that we learn or somehow acquire the language acquisition device itself via some psychological process. Rather, it's kind of acquired in some way, presumably on the basis of some sort of biology, but it's just the exclusion condition which is important. Likewise, people working in number cognition have claimed, someone like Randy Gallistall or maybe Stan DeHen claimed that an approximate number system is innate. And there they mean, or you can interpret them as saying much the same thing, right? That the approximate number system isn't something that's acquired by learning or perception or some process of inference. Rather, it's acquired in some other way under normal conditions. Now, I don't want to defend that as an analysis of what innate means in the mouth of cognitive scientists. It strikes me in retrospect, in the light of a whole bunch of different discussions, both in philosophy and experimentalists, who are interested in sort of trying to understand the way people think and talk about innateness. So Iris is going to go next and talk about these sorts of issues. It strikes me rather that it's a piece of conceptual engineering. It's best thought of as a piece of conceptual engineering. Maybe, roughly speaking, how how cognitive scientists should interpret utterances of the term innate under a range of contexts. But it seems to me that this idea of innateness as psychological primitiveness does focus attention on a central function of innateness talk in cognitive science and psychology. In particular, it focuses attention on what seems to be a really important sort of disagreement, especially in developmental psychology, but more broadly, regarding what Margolis and Lawrence call the acquisition base for psychological theories. So this is Margolis and Lawrence a few years back talking about setting up the problem, which is kind of recognizable to me as a problem for psychology, that humans come to possess, and other organisms as well, come to possess a wide range of different kinds of cognitive abilities, a wide range of concepts and psychological abilities. We also acquire an incalculably large number of beliefs and preferences about the world, the social world, and even about things that don't exist. Now, everyone in developmental psychology, and I'm assuming in pretty much all of cognitive science, assumes that huge numbers of these beliefs are acquired as a function of our psychology. We learn, we perceive the world, we draw inferences, and so on. But where views do divide, especially in developmental psychology, is about the nature and, if you like, the scope or size of the inventory of psychological primitives. So historically, innateness talk has marked such divides. And I'll give you this is an overly simplified way of characterizing it or illustrating it, because really, obviously, it kind of arrays on a continuum rather than sort of this group and that group as a dichotomous group. But if you think about sort of a familiar kind of debate between nativists and empiricists in psychology and cognitive science, you get these different views about the acquisition base. So what the empiricist tends to assume is a relatively austere base. They prototypically think that the acquisition of all psychological traits ultimately depends on only a few perceptual systems and domain general learning systems, whose acquisition is not itself explained in psychological terms. And the richness and variation of the kinds of psychological outcomes we get, the range of beliefs, the variation between beliefs, and so on, is to be explained in terms of environmental conditions. And even where there are domain-specific psychological systems, the presumption is that they themselves are learnt on the basis of more fundamental domain-general psychological systems. If you contrast that with a familiar kind of nativism, and Matthias alluded to this when he talked about core knowledge or core systems, the idea is that there are going to be a wide range of psychological mechanisms, states, and processes whose acquisition can't in turn be explained in psychological terms. So the nativists are assuming, relative to the empiricists, a much richer acquisition base. They're going to assume very typically that there are different domain-specific systems which are going to deploy different sorts of representational formats. And here's a list of various things that have been suggested over the years. Obviously, language, in Spelke, things like reasoning about objects and object recognition, a folk mechanics or a folk physics, numerical cognition, maybe an approximate number system and a small number system, a theory of mind, intuitive biology, and so on. That's sort of like a very small set of potential candidates. So the point I want to make for the moment is just to the extent that research in cognitive science and psychology are punctuated by debates over the acquisition base, the notion of innateness appears to play a very significant role. Okay, too briefly, a few comments about innateness in AI. So I really just want to make 2 points or raise 2 sorts of issues. Obviously, this is very sketchy, much more needs to be said. So the first is really to make the point about AI systems and primitives. And the second thing is to think about how research on the innate basis of human cognition might be relevant to AI, and how AI research might be relevant to research on the innate basis of human cognition. And I apologize, I think the comments here are really kind of obvious, but I think they're worth flagging anyway. Okay, so AI and cognitive primitives. So primitives, there's a banal point. every AI system or type of AI system builds something in. So particularly when you're specifying a computational architecture, say for a learning system, it might be a deep learning system, it might be a Bayesian system of some sort. You need to assume some kind of structure, some sort of process or algorithm of some sort. And you need certain kinds of states as well. You take them for granted, you build them in. Now it sounds odd to talk about innateness as it relates to AI systems, in part because innate is associated with nature, as it were. There's that cultural resonance between talk of innateness and talk of what's natural or part of nature as opposed to something else. So you might wonder how a human artifact could have any innate features at all. But notice that if the central function of the term innate in cognitive science is to identify psychological primitives for a population of cognizers, for example, human beings, then there's pretty obviously an analog for AI. And that's to specify the components of a type of AI system. That is, those primitive components, that is, those features of the AI system that are presupposed by the system, if you like, built into the model, as opposed to acquired on the basis of the model's or system's own computational processes. So there's that idea. There's a kind of analog of psychologically primitive for AI systems. That's really not all that surprising, it seems to me. I mean, when you think about the development of cognitive science, it's very apparent that much mainstream work, not all of it, but much mainstream work in cognitive science is deeply influenced by ideas from computer science, and especially from AI. In particular, the idea that we're in search of, if you like, a basic core cognitive architecture, which is really an analog of specifying the computational architecture for a computational system. So that's one sort of thing. I don't think this is very surprising given the nature of cognitive science in its current format, or mainstream cognitive science in its current format. The second thing is, just as issues about primitive structure are important to ongoing debates about the acquisition base in cognitive development, it seems to me that there really are analogous debates that seem central to at least some ongoing debates in AI. Normally they're more peripheral, but some of the things I have in mind are the kind of disagreements over the scope and limits of deep learning. So a recent popular debate, there have been a range of them, right? So you can find them all over YouTube, are such as the debate between Yann LeCun and Gary Marcus, are, I take it, substantially concerned with this sort of issue. How much primitive structure do you need to build into a computational system in order for it to satisfy some kind of standard of success? Okay, this is going to be very brief, 2 minutes. How might research on an AI on the innate basis of human cognition be relevant to AI? So I think, and this is worth keeping in mind, it really depends on the sort of AI project that we have in question. So if you're looking for a fairly standard kind of one-line characterization of artificial intelligence, it might go something like this. Artificial intelligence is the simulation of human intelligence, processes by machines. So you imagine things like language comprehension or learning or object recognition and so on. The problem is that different sorts of AI projects, it seems to me, adopt different requirements of what counts as successful simulation. And these are two very brief illustrations that they really are too brief, but one is a kind of idea that AI is a cognitive modeling endeavor, where you, in effect, the criterion for successful simulation, at least the ideal, is some notion of strong equivalence. So roughly speaking, what I mean by this is that the computational model successfully simulates a given human cognitive system when it satisfies something like the following conditions. It computes the same function, it implements the same algorithm to compute that function, and they share the same underlying functional architecture. And I think something like this is present, at least as an ideal, in David Ma's work and vision, and much of the vision and some vision research that followed it, but also in recent Bayesian approaches. So Alison Gopnik will be speaking later, but people like Josh Tenenbaum and Tom Griffiths would be, as it were, sort of representatives of this sort of research as well. Now, if we're interested in strong equivalence, then it seems as though AI, innateness would appear to be directly relevant to AI. And the reasons, one reason at least, is pretty obvious, that when you're specifying a functional architecture for a computational system, one of the things you're doing is specifying those primitive components that are required for the system to do its work in order for it to compute. So in effect, if strong equivalence then is going to require that whatever's primitive for a human cognitive system would be primitive for the computational model as well. I don't think most AI falls into that category. I think that strong equivalence is something that cognitive modelers are concerned with. And I take it that most contemporary AI is more of an engineering project than it is a cognitive modeling project. So there are many different versions of this. Comes in different forms where the constraints and standards for success and the measures of success are differently. But the very rough idea is this, that we produce computational systems that relative to some salient standard, it might be a standard of rationality, it might be a standard of time, or it might be relevant relative to human performance, do well at solving tasks that require intelligence in human beings. The thing is, it's just fine on this sort of approach if the AI outperforms human agents. That won't be okay for strong equivalence views. There's no need on this view for the AI to perform the task in the same way as human beings. It doesn't need to be the case it has the same computational architecture. It needn't be implementing the same algorithms either. That's fine, so long as it specifies the relevant engineering standard. I'll stop after this. So notice, in contrast to this modeling conception of AI, for engineering AI broadly construed, there's no constitutive connection to human innateness. If you know that something's innate in a human, there's nothing as such that requires that you build it into your AI. But nevertheless, there is a plausible heuristic function for research on innateness. And the rough idea, at least one motivation, is a pretty obvious one, that you've got a space of computational systems that's extremely large. And might think of AI, human cognition as a kind of evolutionary experiment. So this is Fei-Fei Li talking this way in a recent debate, where what you've got is, if human beings perform this job decently, then that's a good place to start in thinking about how to engineer an AI system. And how successful that is as a research strategy, I take it still remains a point of issue. And I take it that's largely also what's in disagreement between people like Marcus and LeCun. I should note finally that it seems especially apparent that this would be useful in the case of general artificial intelligence, since the broader the range of competencies that a system exhibits, the harder and more improbable it be that such a system is created. So I'll stop there. Actually, there's more, but I'll stop.
Great, thank you very much for an inspiring talk. Now we have time for a discussion. So I'll just remind you that you can ask your questions at the Q&A section. And I will actually start maybe with a simple question, that you mentioned that interaction is in fact default for cognitive science and neuroscience. And it's actually true. So in fact, whenever I see a paper that's, for example, covers a topic of like some instinctive behaviors, there's always this almost like ritualistic mention that, of course, we cannot subscribe like the specific, like we cannot say that the trait is genetic or environmentally caused in some way. But in fact, it very often happens that people write that in the introduction, but then they say, for example, that this trait is genetically determined, or is so the genetic factors are most important. So it's like, seems like ritualistic almost thing that you have to say, but then it doesn't really relate to the way people think.
Yeah, I agree, that does happen. I don't think it always happens. I don't think it need happen. I don't think the best science does that, but I agree it does happen. There's something I shied away from because it's a very, very long story, but Paul Griffiths, Iris Berendt, Josh Nobenai and various other people have sort of done sort of experimental work on how folk and scientists tend to think about innateness. And it seems as though there's a lot of ways of building in things that are confusing. And in the hands of some of that transposes over to the scientific context unless we're very careful.
Yeah, and don't you think that in a way we are, let's say, predisposed to think about things like kind of dichotomical way, that it's easier just to divide things, and even actually by myself, I know that even I like
that might be true. Yeah, that might be true. I mean, I do think it's wise to get away from sort of simply defining our terms. I think, you know, when you're looking, and this is you know, when you're looking at the usefulness, I mean, it seems to me for science, the question that's most central, if we're going to use an antiquated, old-fashioned term with such a lot of baggage as innate, that really the question is it playing some useful function? In a sense, I don't really care if we continue using the word innate. I think generally we are predisposed to fall into those ways of thinking. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, so we need to be mindful. We need to be cautious. We need to correct.
I see.
I think you've got a similar problem for cognitive scientists falling into dualistic ways of thinking as well. I mean, I know neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists who are very, very good neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists that will start talking as if talk of representation is talk of the immaterial. Again, we want to be mindful not to do that because that's not the commitment of the theory, right?
Yeah, I see. And I have also a question, but because like, so you proposed that this definition of innateness, let's say, that is based on primitives, and you're saying that the trait or behavior can be primitive. It's not developed by, and we cannot find any psychological factors that contribute to the development of this trait. But I just wanted to come back to the thing that I mentioned at the beginning, that there's this empirical problem that it's really hard to really prove that there are no, like, for example, there is no learning or there are no experiential factors in the development. Because like even in the isolation studies, we cannot exclude some ways of some forms of experience influencing the development of behavior. Or in case of the studies on infants, they're anyway usually done on infants that are like 3 months old or older. And you can expect that maybe those like very early experiences are important. So first of all, don't you think that there is still this this purely methodological problem? But also, does it really matter? I
do think there's, I mean, I think there's a methodological problem which is familiar across the sciences, and it may be more pronounced here. So there's obviously an underdetermination of one's theory by one's evidence. I take it the general project that developmentalists quite broadly are engaged in is they're looking at certain phenomena and trying to come up with the best models that they can that explain the salient phenomena, that make novel predictions then that can be tested and so on. So I think here, like a lot of places, what you're looking at is what's reasonable to believe in terms of which structures are primitive or not. It's going to be a matter of ongoing empirical research and seeing which models, so relative to a whole range of familiar standards of success or scientific or theoretical virtues, does a better or worse job. And I think that's really the game here. And I think it's a very difficult game to play. I'm glad I don't have that job. But I think that you know, calling it a methodological problem is too strong though, because it's in sense, at the grain that you've described it's a problem that pretty much any science has. Although I'm happy to consider that it's maybe harder in some cases in cognitive science than it is maybe in physics or molecular biology.
I see. So thank you very much for